After the Caitlin Clark stalker gets arrested, Jemele Hill deletes a tweet about Caitlin Clark.
Stalker broke into Caitlin Clark's apartment, but what happened next exposed Jam Hill's deleted tweet about Clark's privilege. The fierce backlash against Hill's comments revealed an uncomfortable truth about women's sports, and it's not what anyone expected.
Jemele Hill got candid about the media response to Caitlin Clark and said, quote, "They're just covering her excellence, and that's good enough. Whereas if it feels like for black athletes to get the same amount of coverage or even fair coverage, there has to be something extra."
The basketball world was rocked when news broke about Caitlin Clark Stalker being arrested. The WNBA star faced a terrifying situation when an unauthorized person entered her apartment complex, but what started as a straightforward safety concern quickly spiraled into something much bigger, touching on issues that have long simmered beneath the surface of women's sports.
Them up so they can further the lies of being victims out there on those basketball streets, right? Well, it all blew up in their face yesterday when Caitlin Clark, she had a stalker arrested, and we found out this guy said some really vile, nasty things to Caitlin Clark, and they did come across as being threatening, and they busted his tail up in Indianapolis.
The details of the incident were chilling. The suspect had been tracked across multiple states following Clark's movements and showing up at various locations where she was scheduled to appear. This wasn't just an overzealous fan. This was a kind of serious threat that makes athletes rethink their entire approach to public life. Enter Jam Hill. Back in September, she had posted a lengthy tweet comparing Clark treatment to that of other WNBA players. Her argument centered on what she saw as a disparity in how different athletes' struggles were perceived and discussed. When news of Clark's stalker broke, Hill quietly tried to delete that tweet, but as we all know, the internet has a very long memory. Hill's original tweet was specific and pointed, "I don't like to play the oppression Olympics." She began before doing exactly that. She noted how Clark hadn't been forced to delete her social media accounts, unlike her teammate Alia Boston. She pointed out how Clark could play physically and talk trash, yet when opponents matched her intensity, they were villainized. The timing of this couldn't have been worse. Just as Hill's deleted tweet resurfaced, Clark was dealing with a very real threat to her safety. This wasn't about social media trolls or mean comments. This was about someone physically tracking her movements, trying to get close to her, creating a situation where a young athlete no longer felt safe in her own home. Clip 4. Where what made the situation even more complex was how it played into existing narratives about women's sports. Hill had tried to frame Clark's experiences as somehow less challenging than those of her peers, but here was Clark facing the kind of threat that transcends any discussion of privilege or preferential treatment.
With it, and here's a perfect example. I mean, goes too far. She takes too much of the black perspective.
The reaction on social media was immediate and intense. Screenshots of Hill's deleted tweets started circulating, often paired with news coverage of Clark's stalker situation. The contrast was stark. On one side, Hill suggesting Clark had it easier than other players. On the other, reports of Clark needing increased security due to a very real threat. Steve Doe, a prominent sports commentator, didn't hold back in his criticism. He called the Simone Biles of the oppression Olympics, suggesting she had a habit of turning every situation into a competition about who had it worse. His comments reflected a growing frustration with how these incidents are often framed in terms of identity rather than safety. The situation got even more complicated when people started digging up other comments Hill had made about Clark. There was a pattern. Whenever Clark faced criticism or challenges, Hill seemed eager to minimize them or suggest they paled in comparison to what other athletes faced. This history made her deleted tweet looked less like an isolated misstep and more like part of a consistent narrative. What's particularly interesting is how this incident forced many to confront their own biases. Some who had previously dismissed concerns about athletes' safety suddenly found themselves defending Clark. Others who had been quick to play oppression Olympics had to recall with the fact that threats and harassment don't discriminate based on background. Media coverage took various angles. Some focused purely on the stalking incident, treating it as a straightforward crime story. Others used it as a jumping-off point to discuss the broader issues of athletes' safety and media responsibility. A few brave outlets even tackled the complicated intersection of race, gender, and privilege that Hill's tweet had tried to address. Sports analysts who regularly covered women's basketball found themselves in a tough spot. Many had relationships with both Clark and Hill, making it difficult to address the situation without seeming to take sides. Some chose to focus solely on the safety aspects, while others couldn't ignore the larger conversation Hill's deleted tweet had sparked. Former athletes started weighing in too. They shared their own experiences with stalkers and threats, highlighting how common these situations are in women's sports. Their stories added crucial context. This wasn't just about Clark or Hill, but about a systemic issue that affects athletes at all levels. The Indiana Fever Clarks WNBA team handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. They increased security measures not just for Clark, but for all their players. Their actions sent a clear message. This wasn't about one player's privilege or lack thereof, but about ensuring every athlete could feel safe doing their job. What became increasingly clear was how Hill's attempt to delete the tweet had actually amplified its impact. If she had left it up and perhaps addressed how the stalking incident had changed her perspective, it might have led to a more productive conversation. Instead, the deletion made it seem like she was trying to hide her previous statements. The basketball community's response was particularly noteworthy. Players from across the WNBA expressed support for Clark regardless of any past rivalries or differences. This show of solidarity highlighted how safety concerns transcend the usual competitive conversation shifted. People began discussing the unique vulnerabilities female athletes face. Their schedules are often public, their movements tracked by media and fans. They are expected to be accessible and engaging while somehow maintaining their personal safety. The incident also sparked discussions about social media's role in athlete safety. Clark's large following, which Hill had previously framed as a sign of privilege, suddenly looked more like a potential risk factor. Every post, every shared location, every public appearance became a potential security concern. The WNBA Players Association got involved, using the incident to push for enhanced security measures across the league. They pointed out how incidents like this affect not just the targeted player, but everyone around them: teammates, staff, and even fans have to deal with the ripple effects of these security threats. What really struck many observers was how this situation exposed the limitations of trying to rank or compare athlete struggles. Hill's deleted tweet had attempted to create a hierarchy of hardship, suggesting some challenges were more valid than others. The stalking incident showed how pointless and potentially harmful such comparisons can be. The timing of all this couldn't be ignored either. Clark had just completed one of the most successful rookie seasons in WNBA history. She'd broken records, drawn new fans to the sport, and handled the massive pressure with remarkable grace. Then, just as she should have been celebrating these achievements, she was dealing with a serious threat to her safety. League officials found themselves in a difficult position. They needed to address the security concerns without creating panic or suggesting their players were constantly at risk. Their public statements walked a careful line between acknowledging the seriousness of the situation and maintaining confidence in their security measures. As the story developed, more athletes started sharing their own experiences with stalkers and threats. These accounts painted a picture of a widespread problem that affected players regardless of their background or status. It became increasingly difficult to maintain Hill's earlier position that some athletes had it easier than others. The incident also highlighted the complex relationship between athletes and social media. Clark's massive following, which had been central to Hill's criticism, was both a blessing and a curse. It brought opportunities and influence, but also increase exposure and risk. This duality challenged simple narratives about privilege and protection in professional sports. The real turning point in this story came when comparisons started emerging between how different media